Okay, this is going to be a lecture on a couple of the biogeochemical cycles, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and how nitrogen and phosphorus can impact waterways, streams, rivers, lakes, and even the marine system. So, first of all, a biogeochemical cycle. So, biogeochemical. So, there's a living component for the bio. Geo is of course kind of a geologic component, and the chemical aspect is the different elements that we might look at. So we might look at nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, carbon, water in the hydrologic cycle. These are all pointing to the fact that elements and even certain molecules like water are continuously cycling around the Earth system. At various times, an element like nitrogen might be a part of living systems, us, for example, other animals, plants. It may also be a part of the atmosphere. It may have gotten incorporated into ocean water or even into geologic deposits. And where it is at a given time, it's going to have potentially different impacts. And so we've actually already talked a little bit about the nitrogen cycle when we were talking about nitrogen fixation earlier on in the role of bacteria and archaea, in how plants grow and how soil basically provides the nutrients for living plant systems. And so you can see in this red circle here, the different components that we actually have already talked about is a significant aspect of that nitrogen cycle. But there's other ones that we want to start looking at, and that is this concept of fertilization. So you can see over here, sorry, it's kind of crossed out there by the circle, but as we use fertilizers, and remember what these fertilizers are made up of, if you look at a fertilizer, there you'll often see the designation NPK, and we talked about this again when we were talking about plants. N for nitrogen, P for phosphorus, K for potassium. And so we are synthesizing these fertilizers on a large scale. We're taking nitrogen from the atmosphere, phosphorus we're pulling up from the ground, potassium pulling up from the ground through mining. We're putting that together in synthetic fertilizers and putting on agricultural land. Those can then run off into different systems. And what I want to talk about a large part during this lecture is what happens as those nutrients enter into these aquatic zones. It can also cause air pollution. So remember we talked about that. Remember that aspect of nitrogen molecules in the atmosphere. One of the big ones we're worried about is nitrous oxide. That's one that's a concern for is a greenhouse gas. So that's another one that will come into play when we start to talk about climate change. But what we're going to center on today is this concept of eutrophication. And that's this aspect of these nutrients entering into aquatic systems. And what eutrophic means, remember that word trophic for feeding. Eu means well. So well fed or well feeding. So we're adding nutrients, we're adding food, if you will, to these aquatic zones. So let's take a quick look at the phosphorus one as well. Here's the phosphorus cycle. Again, similar in terms of there's times when it's part of terrestrial food webs. It's part of geologic systems at times. It's also dissolved in ocean water and other aquatic zones, streams and lakes, for example. And again, here's that issue of fertilizer use and the fact that it runs off. And then it can basically serve as nutrients feeding aquatic plants that are going to potentially have a negative effect if those nutrient levels are too high too quickly. So one of the key things to think about is this concept that in any given ecosystem, a population of organisms grows until it hits some sort of limit. Right? We talked about that when we were talking about population growth and how there's that environmental resistance. That as the population is growing, eventually it's going to get some environmental resistance. And one of those aspects of environmental resistance is limited food supply, right? So limited food can slow down that population growth and level it out. In this case, that limited food could be nutrients for plant growth. And two of the key limiting nutrients you're going to keep seeing are nitrogen and phosphorus. So what happens when we add those limited nutrients to a system? Now, first of all, what I want to make clear is if you look at, let's say we're going to do like a graph here, and let's say we're going to do nutrient levels on the x-axis, and what we might say is kind of environmental benefit on the y-axis. If you have low nutrient levels, then that can be a problem. If you have just the right amount of nutrient levels, then you're going to have a benefit. That would be this bottom-up effect. Right? More plant matter means more food for more animal populations, and so that ecosystem is probably going to be doing well because it has a lot of energy in it. What we're seeing here, though, is that there is actually a possibility that too high a level of nutrients actually can end up causing a problem. It ends up causing environmental harm. It's not always the case. It depends on the ecosystem you're looking at and what communities are there. But generally what we find in aquatic zones, freshwater streams, lakes, marine systems, etc., is a too high a level of nutrients, often in too short a period of time, can actually result in a cascade of negative effects. So what you're seeing over here is that phosphorus is usually limiting in freshwater systems, nitrogen usually in saltwater systems. Don't worry too much about those details. Just know that nitrogen and phosphorus tend to be limiting in most of these aquatic zones. And what that means is in any given system, aquatic plants like algae, for example, have plenty of water, plenty of sunlight, plenty of all the things they need, except they're lacking nitrogen and phosphorus. What that means is once you add that nitrogen and phosphorus, so if nitrogen and phosphorus are entering into this stream, then these algal populations that you see here are going to be kind of let loose. They're going to finally have that nutrient load that they were missing. So with everything else there, that's going to allow them to grow very quickly. These are not invasive. These are native algal species. They're found all over these streams. They're supposed to be there. They're fed on by native invertebrates and mollusks and other different species that are found in all of these streams and estuaries, etc. But now they're growing to a much higher population size than they were before. Now here's the kind of the tricky aspect of this. What we know about plants is they tend to go through photosynthesis, right? So if they're going through photosynthesis, that means CO2 is going into the plants, and the plants are releasing oxygen. So we would assume then that any place that has a lot of plants is going to have a lot of oxygen. But here's the problem. This only works during the daylight. So during the day, this is happening, and you're actually getting a fair amount of excess oxygen being released by these plants. The problem is at night. And so at night, these plants still have to go through metabolism. So throughout 24-hour period, these plants are still taking in oxygen just as much as they're releasing oxygen. Now, when they're going through photosynthesis, the amount they release is much greater than the amount they take in, so they're net oxygen producers. But at night, when there's no sunlight and no photosynthesis, they're net oxygen users. So they're actually taking oxygen out of the water. Now, when they're a very small population size, it's not even noticeable. The levels of dissolved oxygen would not change much between day and night. But when you have a very large population of algae, that's when you really start to see the issue. So for example, here's a data collected in a creek in our area. This is a creek in Carpinteria. And you can see again, lots and lots of this algae. This is all algae in here, right? So one of the things you would predict from this then is that during the day, here I'll put right over here, during the day, we would have high levels of oxygen. And the abbreviation we use is DO for dissolved oxygen because it's dissolved in the water. And keep in mind, all these aquatic species, everything from invertebrates to fish to, anything living in these creeks depends on oxygen, just like anything living on land. There's a few groups that can survive without oxygen. We'll talk about a little bit later, but most of what we think about plants and animals in these aquatic systems. They depend on oxygen just like anything on land does. And in this case, they get that oxygen because that gas, that oxygen is dissolved in the water. So you'll often see, this concept dissolved oxygen, or you'll see it as DO as the abbreviation. So just know that that's what that means. So what you're seeing in this trace is during the daylight hours, the dissolved oxygen levels really go up, and that's because of photosynthesis. But as the sunlight goes away, you can see as the sun goes down that photosynthesis is no longer happening, and now they are net oxygen consumers. And it actually goes into a much lower level. One of the things you're seeing on this graph is this line here, this orange line is what we call a state standard. And you see there that state standard is 7 milligrams per liter. That's the way we measure concentration of dissolved oxygen. And it indicates anything below that is violating state standards. And oftentimes in our area, that state standard is based off what some certain indicator species depend on. And in this case, in our area, it's usually southern steelhead trout. So southern steelhead trout really need oxygen levels above 7 in order to survive well in these creeks. And we're trying to manage these creeks to be suitable for a species like that. The other thing to keep in mind is that if it's suitable for southern steelhead trout, then it's also suitable for many, many other species. Yes, there are species that can survive below that level, but many fewer of them. There's just going to be a much lower biodiversity in these creeks and lower water quality if that dissolved oxygen level is low. So what are some of the things that can happen here is, first of all, you start to get that decline in dissolved oxygen in the area and things start to die off. And you get the bacteria then start to decompose what's dead. So it was on a previous slide, but I'll put it in here too. Bacteria increase for decomposition. And basically that's going to result in a decrease in DO because these bacteria at the time are going to be using oxygen for that. They're aerobic. Eventually, it's going to go to anaerobic conditions, which means low dissolved oxygen. You'll also see the term anoxic, and that's basically without oxygen. Both those terms basically mean without oxygen. And there are species of bacteria and archaea that can operate without oxygen. They're called anaerobes. They're anaerobic. And in addition now to this low dissolved oxygen, which is already a problem killing off many species, when it switches to anaerobic conditions and those bacteria and archaea start to operate, they actually start to release toxic gases like hydrogen sulfide and methane. Hydrogen sulfide, this is the rotten egg smell. It's that sulfur. So if you've ever seen a highly eutrophic freshwater system, it smells, it stinks of kind of this rotten egg smell. And so now you have this combination of basically zero or very low oxygen and toxic chemicals in the water. And that's really going to cause a lot of deaths. And so, for example, over here you see, fish kills where whole populations of fish, basically they're suffocating. And then if that's not enough, the hydrogen sulfide is usually enough to kill them off. And of course, once you have more and more stuff dying, you have that much more stuff to go through decomposition, and the problem can continue to get worse. Now, one of the things we want to realize then is that, you could look at that in a given stream or a given lake. But if you look at some of these much larger watersheds, for example, the Mississippi River here, and you can see kind of the main course of the river, it has all of these areas feeding in to this river. It's a massive, massive watershed. There's a lot of agriculture going on here. So you have the fertilizers, a lot of that being used. You also have a lot of manure from all the ranch lands and all the feeding operations and everything else. Plus you have, these urban systems. And so you have people's lawns, parks, and all of those components. Relatively minor compared to the agricultural zones, just in terms of the total use of fertilizers. But everybody in here is using these, this nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium mix of fertilizer. And all of that's washing in from these huge area. I mean, you can see that this takes up almost, half to a third to a half of the continental U.S., feeding into the Mississippi River, and it's all coming out down here. So there's a really high level of nitrogen and phosphorus coming out at the terminus of the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. What the data show then is, again, here's Louisiana here, here's the Mississippi River, right, coming out. And what this data is showing here, what these colors show here is, again, this oxygen level. There's that milligrams per liter, right? Remember how we talked about, in a freshwater system at least, state standards were 7 milligrams per liter. But what you can see here is, look at these numbers. The red zones mean less than 2 milligrams per liter. So that's basically a lack of oxygen to the point that very few things can survive. And so you get a situation where this entire area we actually will talk about as a dead zone. There's just very few species that can survive in that. So fish have either left the area or died. This really impacts not only the biodiversity of the area, but of course it's going to impact local economies because, whole states, here's Texas, here's Louisiana. These are states that have very large populations of fishermen and fishing fleets and a significant percentage of their economy going into fishing. So in some respects, the food that we're growing higher up in the watershed, the Mississippi River watershed, is sacrificing the food that we're catching in the Gulf of Mexico. So one food supply is actually damaging the other food supply. Now, what they've found is globally throughout the system, is that's not the only place that you're seeing a dead zone. As they've looked, they've found now, basically there's now over 400 known dead zones globally. And you can see where they are here, right around the Gulf, right? So that's a lot of areas from these river systems coming in from the continental U.S. You have a lot of the eastern seaboard here of the U.S., and a lot of that's agriculture and also urban zones. Here's a big zone in the Mediterranean, right? All of those Mediterranean countries with rivers that are kind of outletting into the Mediterranean Sea, and a lot of agricultural zones and heavy urban areas. And here's some other large complex of them in Asia. There are also some on the West Coast as well. So the more we've looked, the more of these we've found. There's actually more dead zones along other continents as well. They're just not showing up quite as much, just because you can see down here the size of them may not be big enough to see so easily. But there's greater than 400 of them now. And it turns out that this impact, this high nutrient level, and again, this is too high. So really, this is kind of too high a level. I don't want you to think that just any nutrient input is a negative. A small amount or over a longer period of time, nutrients are critical to the functioning of any ecosystem. Algae in freshwater marine zones are critical as the base of the food chain for many of these systems. What we're talking about is a system that has too high a level. And when it's human caused, that's why you get this term, we start to call it cultural eutrophication. So when you see that term, sorry, ran out of space there. When you see that term, that cultural component is referring to the fact that it's human caused. So it's our use of fertilizers in agriculture. It's the fact that there's that much more manure on the landscape because of ranching, because of feeding operations, sewage outfalls that are coming from a lack of sewage, a lack of sewage treatment. Other things that can impact this too are wildfires, because all of that burned vegetation now is able to be washed into freshwater systems. And that's something, for example, we've dealt with in Santa Barbara, where the watershed around Lake Cachuma, for example, when that burned during the Zaka fire and all of that ash washed into the reservoir, it was a huge input of nutrients that then actually caused algal blooms that then also impacted the quality of the water. And we actually had to treat our water a little bit more in order to make it drinking water quality. So you have many different ways in which we can add those nutrients to the system. Probably really the key one, though, that we have to worry about are the use of these fertilizers and the animal manure. Those are the ones on the largest human scale, especially in developed countries. A little bit more in developing countries is also the sewage issue. We have a better kind of sewage treatment system generally in developed countries, but that's a very expensive system that requires a lot of infrastructure. Not all the developing countries have that capability, and so they also have a raw sewage problem that can trigger, in addition to other problems like bacteria and viral loads in water, you can contribute to this high nutrient level that creates a high level of cultural eutrophication. And sadly, globally, other than something like climate change, this really is one of the global biggest global impacts to biodiversity is this nutrient pollution. Not plastic, not oil, not radioactive waste, not landfills. It's actually nutrients. These nutrient pollution causing these dead zones causes a bigger impact to overall global biodiversity than almost any other pollution that humans cause.